The discussion will take place between the esteemed Kumi Naidoo, South African social and climate justice activist, the former Secretary General of Amnesty International and Executive Director of Greenpeace, and myself. My name is Lance Gould, and I'm the CEO of Brooklyn Story Lab. Kumi, again, so great to see you. Are you in Joburg today?
Yes, I'm in Johannesburg today. Greetings, everyone. Good to be with all of you.
The NGO International Film Festival is an annual festival of films from around the world that tell purpose-driven stories related to social good endeavors. Both Kumi and myself serve as advisors to the festival. As for today's event, this will indeed be a discussion between Kumi and myself, but we welcome questions from viewers, and we'll save the last 20 minutes of our 40-minute program to hear and answer those questions. The chat will be open for the duration of the briefing. Feel free to submit questions at any time through the chat, and we'll do our best to answer as many as we can at the end of the session, and even invite some of you live to join us on the stage here. We are recording discussion, and we will share the video on the NGO International Film Festival website in the following days. Now for our programming. We are currently plagued by what some have called the 3 C's: climate, COVID, and conflict. The latter covers not just the war in Ukraine and other military struggles, but also social justice and equality. The UN's IPCC report, which is the periodic synthesis by scientists of all from the last few years, has confirmed that we are not on track to achieve the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, by 2030, which is a mere 6 years away now. To do so, we have to sacrifice means and ways in our current lifestyle, particularly around the use of fossil fuels, or we face irreversible heat domes, oceans nearly bubbling with heat, historic flooding, wildfires, creating unbreathable air for even 1,000 miles away. So we need to fast-track ideas to stop the bleeding, as well as address issues related to our planet's other greatest challenges, from education to equality to food security. But there's not always a political will to do so. And that's where storytelling can be so helpful in shaping our future. Kumi, will you please share your thoughts with us on all of this and the role that storytelling can play?
Thank you very much, Lance. The moment we find ourselves in, we could say it's as Lance correctly said, that it's the hottest our planet has ever been. Another way of seeing it, it's the coolest our planet will ever be on the trajectory that we are. 20 years from now, we might be looking back if we do not get a scale of mobilization and a scale of urgency that we've never seen before. We are running into very, very difficult timeline issues. So when I reflect on why we're not winning fast enough or big enough, I come to the answer that a key part of that is our inability to communicate creatively enough, impactfully enough, emotionally enough, passionately enough, that can move people to understand the urgency of the moment that we find ourselves in, and to communicate in ways that move people to want to participate. Now, I think a lot of activism, actually, in the narratives that we have engaged in, including things that I've been part of, we speak in a language that is way above people's general knowledge. So when we talk about 1.5 degrees, 350 parts per million and so on, 99% of the people on our planet don't really engage with that kind of conversation. So I want to give you an example, right, to just make the point. So in 2011, I found myself on an inflatable boat heading to occupy an oil rig in the Greenlandic Arctic. And my colleagues could see that I was quite nervous, and they were telling me, because I don't swim very well, and they were telling me, oh, don't worry, Kumi, if you fall into the ocean, because the waves were very rough, we'll be able to fish you out, and with what you're wearing, you'll survive at least 2 hours. I suddenly had this horrible thought about if this was the last action that I would be engaged in my life for justice, that the placard that I was holding would not make sense to anybody, mainly people in my continent, back home in Africa, who said, stop Arctic destruction. This was in 2011 when I think most people didn't understand the Arctic serves as a refrigerator and air conditioner for the planet. And when the Arctic sea ice is melted in the summer, it means that the harshness of the sun's rays cannot be reflected back. So after a week in prison, when I got back home to South Africa, one of my cousins, and she said, save Santa Claus now. And if you think about it, it's pretty brilliant, because what she was saying is, you activists communicate in a way that does not understand where the consciousness and cultures of people are. And we have to be able to make that connection if we're going to be able to move people. And so quite often we are speaking in languages and in narratives that don't resonate with people. And the best way we can move people into action is by stories that are about telling the urgency of what we find ourselves in, and then also moving people into imagining different futures. And I think that's another very important thing about film, arts and culture more broadly, because right now the other gap we have is that there is an absence of the kinds of solutions that we need for the future. Our political and business class is completely stuck. And we need the words of arts and culture, we need artivism, we need storytelling to actually help us imagine different ways of being. But even if you take, the last point I'll make for now, is if you take like 1.5 degrees, which is a scientific kind of target, which we have to stay under, and we're already beyond 1.1 degrees already. But I tell a story about that, which makes it a little bit more real. So for example, in July 2015, I found myself in the Pacific, in Fiji, in Vanuatu, in Kiribati. I learned a new slogan in July of 2015, and people were chanting 1.5 to stay alive, 1.5 to stay alive. 6 months later, I meet my new friends from the Pacific at the Paris climate negotiations, and they invite me to speak at a rally that they had got permission for inside the climate negotiations. And I go there, they give me the microphone, and I was about to start saying 1.5 to stay alive, and they started waving. They said, no, the slogan has changed. And the new slogan was 1.5, we might survive. So I'm not saying that we should not try to communicate complex stuff to people, but we need to do it in ways that are accessible, that are captivating, and that is accessible to the knowledge that people have, so that we can move people into action. So I conclude by saying storytelling right now on its own will not deliver us a success from addressing the climate crisis. But without storytelling and artivism more generally, we don't have a chance to turn things around. Thank you.
No need to conclude. This is an ongoing conversation. Those are brilliant points, and it's so true. The 1.5 is 1.5 to stay alive, 1.5 we might survive. Very catchy ways of complex scientific information. But on the other hand, it's very difficult to have a universal approach to 1.5 because it's not everyone even uses Fahrenheit or Celsius. So it's a complex thing to try to understand. But I love the way that captured the threat, the urgency of the situation, and it rhymes, easy to remember. It's a great moment in the timeline of activism. You mentioned while you were on your Greenpeace story in the Arctic very, very, very briefly noted that you know, after a week in prison, but like we have arrested for activism, growing up in South Africa in the apartheid region, and the apartheid regime. You were no stranger to dealing with the authorities. Tell us about your journey and how art and activism can take down powerful institutions like governments and things of that nature.
So, you know, let me start by saying that there's a quote. I have one thing in common with Donald Trump. Both of us made an error. I used to say that this was a Gandhi quote, but would said, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, and then you win. It's often attributed to Gandhi, Mahatma Gandhi. Trump also made the same mistake. But actually, it was said by a labor organizer in the United States in the beginning of the 20th century. And so when I look at repression that civil society activists are facing, and including some of what I have experienced myself, being arrested, you know, in my teens and then in my early 20s, we were able to have the sense, well, first they laugh at you, they're not laughing at us. First they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you. And the reality is they are fighting us really hard. So if that wisdom is correct, given the repression that civil society activists are facing around the world, let's hope that we are one step from winning. So, you know, my journey, a typical South African journey at the age of 15, in a national student uprising against inequality in education. The slogan at the front of the march was, "We want equality." By the time the slogan got to the back of the march, the younger kids were chanting, "We want a color TV," because they thought that was the slogan at the front of the march. But the truth is, if I'm brutally honest, at that time I wanted a color TV and equality almost equally, and both appeared equally unattainable. So right now, we should look at the repression coming at us, primarily from governments, but also with big companies in the fossil fuel sector and other polluting industries who collude with government, right, in what are called SLAPP suits. SLAPP, it stands for Strategic Litigation Against Public Participation, where companies will take organizations to court solely to actually terrify you, tie you up, give you a sense that they're going to take all your assets and so on. So I want to say, let's not be intimidated by the repression that is coming our way, but let's at the same time recognize how bad it is. So Global Witness brings out a report annually about the repression that especially environmental activists are facing. And they find now that if you average it out, 4 activists per week are killed. Right, mainly in places like the Amazon and Congo Basin forests and so on. But I keep wanting to say to people, you know, pessimism is a luxury we simply cannot afford in this moment of history. And therefore, whatever repression comes our way right now, as in the past, we need to recognize that the fact that they feel it necessarily to come after us is the fact that justice is on our side, that we have momentum, and they're scared about growing momentum. So please read repression, not simply on protesters.
And I'm sure that's all that you have in common with Dr. Trump.
Sorry, Lance, I missed that.
I said, I'm sure that's all that you have in common with Donald Trump. That's where the similarities.
Yeah, I hope so.
The NGO International Film Festival features filmmakers from all over the world, and so there are perspectives that are on display that those of us in the West or the global North, such as myself, not necessarily just get to see on a regular basis. For example, through my work we did with water.org, we know that toilets in the world, girls in India drop out of school in the millions every year because there are no bathrooms. And once they start menstruating, there's no place for them to address their needs. There were a couple of films I saw in last year's NGO International Film Festival competition that addressed this issue and demonstrated difficulties of navigating that scenario through the eyes of a character is so meaningful and powerful. Kumi, tell us a little bit about how storytelling in that way, giving sympathetic characters to address complex issues or issues we wouldn't normally think about, can be so powerful.
So yeah, I want to pay tribute to someone who I think many of you will know, somebody who influenced my own thinking and encouraged me to embrace Artivism in its fullest sense, but also see the critical role that film in particular as well. And yeah, I would really like to pay tribute to Jess Search, one of the co-leaders of Doc Society, who sadly passed away recently from brain cancer. She was somebody who was a teacher to me in terms of understanding that we need to be telling stories in ways that makes complex issues accessible to ordinary people. In the old days, just in Punjab, they used to always talk about, personal stories. You know, if you told, if you had a bit of a, not just talking about the political or the social issue, but you said something about the person, their background, why they're doing what they're doing, and so on, makes everything much more real and live. And so I've seen that, so many people have used film in a way that has exploded many, many issues. The one that gets referred a lot was, in fact, Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth. And that, did completely have an impactful, result in terms of shifting people. But you can take many, many other documentaries that tackle, like if you take the question that you addressed of period poverty, that is an issue that is hidden from many, many people globally. So, like, for example, when Mandela's 100th birthday, the Nelson Mandela Foundation did a 100th anniversary sort of commemoration, and I was part of about 50 people at Mount Kilimanjaro. Out of the menstruation cycles, the fact that they often have to miss 2-3 days at home, and so on. So I can get on a platform and tell the story, and you can get on a platform and tell the story about how bad an issue it is. But I can tell you, I have no doubt in my mind, if you took 5 young girls who appreciate that problem, who experience it, who have got first-hand knowledge of it, their stories will move people much better than an advocate standing up and speaking on their behalf, because people can see the direct impact, and people will see themselves in such young people, in this particular case, speaking out. So
that's an excellent point. And I was referring more, I was referring less documentary or filming, where you, like many of us, where you take a but you fictional narratively so the impact that.
Lance, I should tell you and your viewers that I'm in South Africa at the moment, and we have what's called load shedding, which means we have this terrible electricity cuts. So today we have 8 hours of it, and sadly I'm in an unscheduled one. So I must confess that I didn't hear your question clearly. So may I kindly ask you to repeat it, and I hope I'll hear it this time.
No problem. And that's what's wonderful about the Instagram Live or other discussions that people have, like we can have now international, where we can have a window into that situation. Because I was not aware that that was a current problem in South Africa. Thank you for it's really it's really sensitive what we're talking about, having a window into the life of other living at the moment. But what I was saying is, I was talking about documentary filmmaking and more about fictional film, like the film festival, where the weight of the story, rather than documentary filmmaking is a skill that is not necessarily translatable to a filmmaker who's a narrative story. But there's a whole other skill set that they have in creating a story based on a problem. So tell us a little bit about your perspective to how fictional filmmaking can play that same role.
Absolutely. And I think fictional filmmaking has more appeal, obviously. One of the things people say about documentaries sometimes is that people who gravitate to watch documentaries are usually having some sympathy with the issue already. I don't think that's always the case. I think documentaries also build new audiences and spread knowledge to new audiences. But I very much think that the moment we find ourselves in is we have a lack of imagination. Our political leaders have run out of fresh things to say, as have our business leaders. They agree with us now that we are running out of time to get off fossil fuels, for example, but they are immobilized by the vested interests of the current moment that they find themselves in. And yeah, I want to particularly make a comment of young filmmakers and young cultural creatives, that my generation suffers from a problem of contamination. Let me explain that. When you have lived and experienced life and seen inequality being so rampant and so on, what happens is you actually, after decades of seeing that, you think that is normal. And actually, what is needed most urgently right now is fresh lenses. We need to look at old intractable problems with a freshness of perspective, right? And part of what is arts and culture in its broadest sense, and fictional filmmaking in a specific sense, taking those issues and speaking about it in stories that are appealing, that are moving, that are emotional and all of that, but also telling the stories in a way that you can imagine different futures, right? So let me just give a simple example, right? One of the things we're not willing to accept quite often, even in the activist community, is that if we were to deliver on poverty the same lifestyles that people in the North America and Europe, for example, live, that we will need between 3 and 8 planets, right? And we have just one planet. And therefore, you know, one of the slogans is there's no plan B but to address climate change because there's no planet B, right? And so part of what is needed right now is fictional filmmaking and other forms of artistic expression to talk about the world of greater equality, to talk about the fact that the worst disease that humanity faces is not COVID, is not influenza or HIV/AIDS, but it's a disease we can call affluenza, where far too many people in the world have been led to believe that a good, decent, meaningful life comes from more and more and more material acquisitions. So to address an issue like that, you don't need somebody like me standing up and giving a story about affluenza and what it means and all of that. But tell the story of a fictional person who thinks that their life is going to be so great because they can accumulate so much of money, but to show actually to a large extent that people have very little. So I want to just make this point. In your introduction, Lance, you said that people have to, make changes and to their lifestyles and all of that, which is totally true. But I think quite often people present those lifestyle changes as if it's going to be a bad thing, right? So I want to say that actually a lot of the interventions that we need, for example, if people walked, cycled more than drove, right? That's not a hardship. That is a good thing for people's health in a time when we are seeing mental health and physical health in a terrible decline, also because of growing climate anxiety. So I think fictional films help us imagine different possibilities. And I think that that is what people remember. And that's what moves people more than, however an eloquent speech one might be able to give.
This is why you're such a perfect person to speak with. Affluenza is so brilliant. It's like 1.5, we might survive. It's a perfect example of why you're such an amazing artivist and such a great storyteller. One thing to discuss, you were talking about how activists have to rethink their approach. Do activists have to rethink their approach to corporate? You also mentioned Planet B. There is no Planet B. Remind me of the B team, which is a nonprofit that we work with that involves me, from Richard Branson, Paul Coleman, Ariana Huffington, to Muhammad Yunus, Mary Robinson, and Christiana Figueres. Mary Robinson and Christiana Figueres, I think, brilliantly employed the 1.5 to Stay Alive campaign to make the Paris Climate Agreement such a success, relative at least to other COPs that, of course. But look at what needs to be done to achieve. We talked about changes to lifestyle, but we also, realistically, the public sector will never raise the trillions of dollars necessary every year to achieve the SDGs. And that's why I think SDG 17, partnerships, is so important. If we can reach out to the private sector, because we do need private sector capital to achieve the SDGs. What is your comfort level with your activist background and realistic and understood of the business community, but what is your appetite for engaging with the private sector, whether it's storytelling or other things? Opportunity to engage with that private capital that we need to achieve the SDGs.
So I have so many things to say about this, but let me do it through a story, I think is the best way. So when I become the head of Greenpeace in 2009, I go to the Copenhagen climate negotiations.
Kumi, I'm sorry, you cut off for a second.
Okay, can you hear me now? So let me answer the question through a story. So I joined Greenpeace just as the Copenhagen climate negotiations were taking place, which was a complete disaster. We went there with the slogan of, we want a fab deal, not a fabulous deal, but a fair, ambitious, and binding deal. What we got was a flab outcome, FLAB, full of loopholes and bullshit. And then 2010 comes in January. Even the business community in the world, who are a little bit more reasonable and were wanting to kind of address the climate stuff. When I get to Davos as the head of Greenpeace, whereas for 10 years before I was going as the Secretary General of Civicus World Alliance for Citizen Participation, which is a much bigger network of NGOs, trade unions, civil society groups, and so on. But I never could get a meeting with any CEO of a company at Davos. But when I was going at Greenpeace, before I even arrived at Davos, my schedule was full with requests from CEOs wanting to meet with me, and I got late to one of the CEOs, in fact, that you mentioned was part of B Team, and I said, wow, you guys never wanted to meet with me before, now you're all wanting to meet with me, and he said to me, Kumi, you know, some of us are desperate to get Greenpeace and you to the table because we don't want to be on your menu. Yeah. Right, of activism. So, but let's just say that there's corporates and corporates. I think those in the fossil fuel sector, oil, coal, and gas companies, and those that are driving deforestation must be understood as being out of touch with history, that they are betraying their own children and grandchildren's futures, and that they carry culpability for the moment that we find ourselves in. That they falsified the science, they ran and still run misinformation campaigns and so on. So I'm not going to waste my time trying to get them to actually fund or be good citizens right now. We have to go after them as if they are the enemy of the people, because that's exactly what they are. However, to paint...
You have a British petroleum claims they're cleaning up the Gulf of Mexico after polluting the Gulf of Mexico.
Yeah, and you know, British BP, British Petroleum, when at one stage they rebranded themselves beyond petroleum and they were moving in the renewable energy direction, which is what they should have stuck with and intensified. But now what the leaders of the fossil fuel industry say is we have already landed. We have, you know, in the sense that we have, you know, we agree that we have to get off fossil fuels. But what they're wanting to do is stretch the lifespan as far into the end of the century as possible. We need to be having a more creative approach, because see, if you look at what the science is saying and where we are, if we have to keep things below 1.5 degrees, and already at beyond 1.1, veering 1.2, we're already seeing the kinds of climate impacts that we are seeing. We can, you know, the science can't tell us that when we get to 1.3, whether it's going to quadruple, increase by 10 times, and so on. But what we know is that on a weekly basis right now, somewhere in the world, we are seeing an extreme climate-related or climate-induced weather event where people are losing lives, infrastructure, and so on. So therefore, how we engage with the corporate sector at this moment is very important, because I would argue we don't have time anymore to go after every oil, coal, gas, deforesting company, and so on. We have to follow the capital to see, follow the money and see who is funding these various climate-destroying, life-threatening carbon bomb projects. And so, for example, recently I was part of Extinction Rebellion protests here in South Africa against Standard Bank that is funding a 900-mile pipeline in Uganda and Tanzania where 100,000 people will be displaced. We're already seeing human rights violations, and all of that oil actually goes to Europe, to the Netherlands, to a refinery there. So what we find is that the banks, for example, as a sector, actually have a lot, all the lending institutions who are a core part of the corporate sector, they decide what succeeds, what gets funded, and so on. We need to be putting our energy there. It's something I started arguing very strongly while at Greenpeace, but didn't quite succeed to get traction within Greenpeace at that time. But now I'm happy to see that a much broader set of organizations recognize that we have to go and shut the flow of capital to these negative, environmentally unjust projects. Having said that, when I was at Greenpeace, and I still maintain this, that we need to find dialogue and engage with dialogue with brutal honesty. So I'll give you an example. Metro, it's a large, I think it comes after Walmart, it's a retail entity. And I met the CEO at the World Economic Forum in Davos. He had a problem with one report we brought out. And I said, listen, if you want to have a chat, bring your entire management team to the headquarters of Greenpeace, and we will I'll get my colleagues to engage in a dialogue. And they were based in Strasbourg, and they drove 2 hours. They came. We had a day together where at the end, I was able to look the CEO in, because they have a line of business in marine products, in fish. And so I said, do you know, I could make an argument to you, sir, that I am more committed to the long-term interests of your business than you are committed to it, because if we continue the way that you are doing with overfishing and so on, the end result is you'll kill that line of business. We are not saying that people should not fish. Of course, 1 billion people in the world rely on fish and other ocean-based products for their protein, right? So we simply are saying you need to fish sustainably. In that case, that company moved in a positive direction, not as far as we wanted them to go. But I think I will just end this thing by saying when I was in Brazil, for the first time in my Greenpeace role, I asked my colleague there, Marcelo Furtado, who was heading up Greenpeace Brazil at that time, to set up a meeting with the business community. And we had a breakfast engagement with them where about 60 of the leading business people in Brazil came out for it. There were some journalists in the audience, you know, sort of financial journalists. And one journalist put up a hand and asked me this question, which is very important. She said, you know, some of us in Brazil were very critical of the, you know, during the military dictatorship and subsequently to politicians who were espousing anti-democratic values, as well as business leaders who were taking us in the direction of climate destruction. And we had an engagement with them. And things got awkward after that. Because, see, when you meet somebody in a setting like that, you can see their humanity in the sense of, do they have kids? Do they, you know, about their families and so on. And the end result is, there is a question about whether contact actually makes activism soft, right? What I used to do when I was at Greenpeace, if ever I was meeting with any CEO, I went online, nothing illegal. I just used to go online and see what they said, not in their work lives, but in their personal lives. You know, did they have kids and so on? And I would literally say, what are you going to say to your 15-year-old daughter when in a few years' time she's going to say, why did you not act when the science was clear? So I would say that we have to engage with the private sector, but we must not assume that engaging with the private sector is a walk in the park, because even some of the founders of some of the constituent parts of B Team are not as progressive on their taxation responsibilities as we would like them to be, right? So nobody is perfect in that world. It's you know, but it's up to us to try to get the best out of them, right? And so, you know,
what was interesting said about the marine CEO that you, the marine oriented CEO that you talked about, about being more interested in the future of his business than he was. It seems that with every business scenario regarding the climate, the sustainability of the planet, there's three reasons that they should engage with it. One is the moral responsibility, but of course that's the one that they're going to pay the least attention to. One is the opportunity possibility, because there's opportunity for them to make money, which is, you know, not necessarily a bad thing if they can find a successful route to capital or from legitimate business. But then there's also the risk. If they don't act, they risk losing their life, losing the model by action. So that was a really interesting point that you made to the CEO. What was the reaction to that?
So, you know, the most powerful slogan in the climate movement was not articulated by an environmentalist, but was articulated by a board member of the B Team, who's Sharon Burrows, the former head of the International Trade Union Confederation.
Yep.
And that line was, there are no jobs on a dead planet. There are no jobs on a dead planet. I mean, and this came out in a conversation with Ban Ki-moon, where we were meeting him on the fringes of the Rio Plus 20 conference in Rio, and we played this kind of joke where I gave her my speaking notes, she gave me her speaking notes, and we went in and we swapped it, and so she was like giving the climate fight, and you could see Ban Ki-moon was like, why is this trade union lady banging on about climate change? And then she said, you might wonder, Secretary General, why I'm doing that, because as a parent, no human rights, because there will be no human beings and there will be nothing here if we continue on the way that we are. So in that sense, it's irresponsible for moving in that direction, but I would still argue that a lot of what we are seeing from the private sector is still greenwashing, right? Having said that, I also want to raise an unpopular point, and that is, if we are brutally honest with ourselves, right, we are not going to shift the dynamic, right, unless and be dependent on corporate money. Of course, we need to push both corporates and governments in the global north to fulfill their commitments and recognize that when folks in the global south are asking for support to mitigate and adapt to climate change, we're not asking for charity. We're asking those institutions in the global north to pay their climate debt, right? This is about recognizing that folks in Africa, for example, who have contributed tinily to the emissions that we have, but we are paying the first and most brutal price. So in that context, I want to say that often these conversations we also have to start imagining now, how can we actually get things done on our own terms without necessarily being dependent on organizing themselves, and are also saying, listen, if government won't organize clean energy for us, we're going to set up a community renewable energy grid, for example. And I'm not saying that it's happening on a mass scale, but it's happening increasingly more in many, many places. So part of it is to make sure that we don't, while we should push the corporate sector and business to be much more generous, much more honest, much more serious than they currently are, we should not be waiting for them to change. We need to recognize that we can embarrass them into action sometimes by mobilizing our own capacity as citizens and civic movements, and actually showcasing some of the solutions ourselves, so that we send a clear message to government that what is lacking is not the solutions, but what is lacking is political will.
Absolutely. You touched briefly on the vulnerability of certain communities and their lack of responsibility for the current scenario that we have. The points greatly to the work Barbados Prime Minister Meet Motley really led the movement for the loss and damage fund at the last. He's doing such great work there. I want to recognize that we have about 15 minutes left before we get some questions from the audience. But another question first. I have plenty more questions, but one more couple film festival we could guess this one. But it seems more important than ever to own our own narratives at this moment, because there is a lack of trust around news in this generation, understandably. That is the rise of particularly media like this one, like on Facebook, with one called Twitter. I won't even mention the new name of it. It's the best way to break through the noise, to not have to rely on traditional media sources, but create your own. Tell us about how you're navigating the traditional news media. I'm not blaming quote unquote mainstream media, but I'm saying that there is a competition with media from disinformation and from misinformation, mainly from social media channels, how we can combat that with our own storytelling.
So, thank you, Lance. This is a critical question, right? Because, it's been said by theoreticians and so on before that the biggest threat we face is not the repressive state apparatus, by which I mean army, police, formal laws, and so on, but actually, bad as that might be, and the fact that the repressive state apparatus does create the theater for public life and civic life. But the biggest threat we actually face is the ideological state apparatus, by which we mean the framework for education, the framework for religion, the framework for funding arts and culture, and most critically, the framework for communications and media. Now, absolutely, I fully support the need to create alternative and creative forms of media that are sometimes called alternative media, progressive media, independent media, and so on. And that is critically needed. And that I think an explosion of that, we are seeing some signs of it in some parts of the world, is welcomed and creates more media diversity. However, I want to caution here that we must not assume that that collectively balances off the impact of the penetrative consciousness building mainstream media, in the sense that while, yes, social media has also created some balancing effects, but this seems to have benefited the fascist right as much as the progressive left. But all of this leads us to a conclusion that we cannot walk away from trying to make sure that mainstream media or establishment media is pushed to be as climate sensitive as possible, as committed to the broader challenges as encompassed in Sustainable Development Goals and other global agendas. And I think that part of developing strong alternative media possibilities in itself is an encouragement for the mainstream media to be better and more rise to the full sort of challenge of what it means to be good journalists and good media companies. I'll give you an example. Here in South Africa, we had a crazy story recently where a guy that was supposedly died in prison a year ago suddenly is seen at a rapist was suddenly seen at a supermarket and all of that, and then eventually that story was broken by an alternative newspaper, Ground Up. They did all the works. They're a small, progressive, alternative media group. They did all the hard work, broke the story, and then, the guy was eventually arrested in Tanzania with his wife and brought back to South Africa and now in prison and so on. So I'm just giving you a non-sort of political story, but to say that don't underestimate what and of course, now that's the major mainstream story for months in South Africa since this incident. So don't underestimate how the work of alternative media can actually prod the mainstream media to actually wake up and smell the coffee, which they sometimes appear they need to do.
Thank you for that. On the flip side of the social media debate is for storytellers is the power that allows with viral possibilities. One project that's been particularly meaningful for me is working with elephants. In fact, the last time I was in South Africa was on this elephant project where we helped move 200 elephants to South Africa. There were too many elephants for the ecosystem to handle. Most where there was virtually none. It was a win-win for the ecosystem for both locations. That led me to be on the board of World Elephant Day, which is one of the first nonprofits to see the opportunities for storytelling via social media. Every year on August 12th, they get more than 1 billion social media impressions. Because World Elephant Day vehicle, we're calling it the Flight of Elephants, creates an opportunity for scores of other organizations to take part in the event, whether it's Greenpeace or World Wildlife Foundation. They all utilize the hashtag World Elephant Day, which only creates an echo chamber of success for the day. There was a book called New Power You might be familiar with it. It was written by Jeremy Hyman from Purpose, right? The book looks at intentionally ungoverned movements as a way to achieve virality. Examples range from Giving Tuesday, which Henry helped create, to the Ice Bucket Challenge, to the Black Lives Matter movement. All of these initiatives create a banner under which people can create their own messages, allowing for more creativity, and there's no organizational hierarchy at the top to monitor or enforce narratives on the participants. That is why World Elephant Day has been so successful. Tell us about the power of viral possibilities for storytelling. And then we'll go to some questions from the audience.
Okay, no, I think you've captured it well. It's really, really powerful. I'll give you an example. When I was at Greenpeace, we were trying to get Nestle to stop buying palm oil from newly deforested areas in the Sumatran forest in Indonesia. And we discovered that we're using palm oil that was grown there in Sumatra in Kit Kat, you know, the chocolate. And we simply had an advert that we did where we had a bored office worker waiting for his tea break to come, and when the tea break comes, you know, the advert, have a break, have a Kit Kat. He opens the chocolate, and instead of it being a bar of chocolate, it's a finger of an orangutan, and he bites it and blood spills all over his keyboard and so on. We had been talking to Nestle for months and months and months. We couldn't move them. When that advert broke, they got so much of negative publicity on their social media. First, they played into a trap. We deliberately used the Kit Kat branding and the Nestle branding because we wanted them to make a fuss about that. So what they did was they took us off. They went to YouTube and complained, and YouTube took the video off and banned us for a couple of weeks or something. And then that became a story in itself. And we then put it on Vimeo, I think. And we had, normally a video like that would reach like maybe 100,000 people in the first couple of days. This thing reached 5 million people. So it's also about how you can use media in a way that really gets underneath people and pulls at their heartstrings. And I've seen multiple examples of it.
As always, Kumi, I imagine nothing from an amazing story to share with us. It's up to the audience, and someone from the NGO Film Festival get some questions.
Hello, here I'm Natalia, I work with the NGO, the International Film Festival, and I'll be addressing some questions that arrived to us through the chat here or individually in a private form, okay? So the first one is, we have seen that advocacy and campaign films create more awareness to a new audience that are more likely never engaged, but now aware of certain global issues. As you've mentioned, that storytelling only will not help us, but it will serve as a driver or simplified issues. What is the scale of importance of storytelling right now to the youths who are not conscious yet?
Young people in particular, and older people as well, love stories. The people in the middle also like stories, but they don't seem to like it as much as young people and older people seem to, for different reasons. And so I have seen young people being able to tell their stories and move older generations by being great storytellers, using social media and so on. I think what we need, especially from young people right now, in how they do that, is also pushing my generation, which I have confessed are the biggest bunch of losers you're going to find, because we have known about how bad this is, and we have not been able to shift and make things happen. So young people, I would just say, don't accept it when people in my generation say young people are the leaders of tomorrow. If you wait for tomorrow to take leadership, there won't be a tomorrow for you to take leadership.
Another question. How much of the recent global disasters be attributed to climate change?
In terms of the environmental disasters, you know, flooding in Pakistan, my home city in Durban last year losing 450 people in 2 days from what the local people called a raid bomb, the extreme weathers we're seeing in Europe and North America, all of it is clearly what the science warned us about. Only thing that is different is it's much more serious and much more earlier than some of what the science, warned us about. However, there's also other disasters, right? If you look at some of the conflicts that we are seeing in the world, those conflicts are also driven by the anger and rapaciousness for fossil fuels and so on. We in Africa often say, because people in the global north often paint us as a very poor continent and we are a disaster, blah, blah, blah. We like to say that Africa is the richest continent underneath the ground, and that's precisely why we are the poorest continent above the ground, what in the literature is called the resource curse. So,
Kumi, I might add that when it comes to conflict, some of that is driven by climate change. If you look at the Syria crisis, you had an agrarian society facing desertification. You had 1 million people who had to move from an agrarian scenario to a city that was Damascus that was already a tinderbox, fomenting more political crisis, which led to a huge refugee crisis. That refugee crisis that has led to Brexit, that has led to so much other conflict in the world, can all be attributable to climate.
Absolutely. And if I can just raise a similar case, Lance, Darfur, right? Darfur was what Ban Ki-moon called the first major resource war as a result of climate crisis, because Lake Chad, one of the largest inland seas in the world, basically, according to Ban Ki-moon speaking in 2010, had shrunk to a size of a pond, right? So if you have, we're seeing increasing desertification and so on. So many of the conflicts in Africa and elsewhere now is about water, is about land, is about natural resources. And in that sense, we need to understand that, you might be surprised, I don't generally quote intelligence agencies as a source of much truth, but the CIA and the Pentagon already in 2003 released a report which said in the coming decades, the biggest threats will not come from conventional threats or terrorism, but will come from the impacts of climate change. And on this one year, I think they got it right, because we are seeing over the last 2 decades a lot of connectivity between conflict and climate impacts.
I have time for one more, and then we have to wrap up.
I will make a personal question. You were mentioning Brazil, and I'm from Brazil, and you're mentioning about the generations, like the past generations, how it's difficult to bring some kind of consciousness about understanding how we need a planet for the future generations. And I have seen this in family, friends, and I have seen some people saying that it doesn't make a lot of difference if you have personal changes like separating your trash and recycling and changing your food habits, because the problem is too big, and just these personal attitudes will not change the whole problem. We need bigger companies and changing their habits. So because just our personal ones will not make a lot of difference or no difference at all, even if we save a lot of water in the shower. And coming from a country where this is a big problem, and it's a country that is killing a lot of its natural sources for food, for example, or deforestation or pollution, and considering the cultural habits of my country as well, that is basically based on telenovelas kind of style and films that are based on this kind of style as well, or comedies. How can this artivism and how can the use of media bring some kind of consciousness for the kind of cultures that and communities that actually have to survive every day and don't have a lot of options to choose from, like the better ones, the conscious ones, but they just have to consume what they have access to because they don't have a lot of options. They're very poor, and maybe this kind of media that can seem a little bit trashy is what they have to help them survive every day and get distracted from their life.
So two quick comments. One is telenovelas and more soapy type media and movies and so on. I would say we can't ignore them because large numbers of people actually watch them. And in the theory, there's two terms that we need to embrace: infotainment and edutainment. And here in South Africa, for example, one of the most popular soapies or weekly shows was actually produced by an NGO called Soul City, which dealt with issues of gender-based violence, HIV/AIDS, and so on, and was really powerful. But what it did was it did it in a way that was super entertaining, that spoke to people's, interests and so on. So I think it's important that we don't abandon it. We try to say, okay, it's a reality. How do we actually kind of try to influence it? And while we also, of course, can create our own. But I don't think we have the luxury to say, that thing is like low-class entertainment or whatever, and the serious people are not watching that. So those are the people that we need to reach. The last thing I would say is about, when I was at Greenpeace, I always used to say, recycling is a good place to start, but it's a bad place to end, right? So it's important that each of us as individuals, say to ourselves, we're either part of the problem or we're part of the solution. And by choosing to reduce our consumption, reduce our carbon footprint and so on its own, of course, it's not going to actually have a huge impact. But if tens of millions of people do the same, right? If tens of millions of people do the same, then in fact, we can see action. But it's true what the young people are saying. Beyond those, you've got to recognize that the clock, and maybe this is a good way for me to end, I would say that the window of opportunity to avert the worst of the climate crisis, recognizing it with us at the moment, the window of opportunity to turn things around is small and closing fast, but it's not closed, right? It's closing fast. And therefore, we have to recognize in this moment, we need to open up the opportunity, give ourselves more possibility while we look always for more and more creativity and solutions. And that's the spirit that we need to have. And I want to end with repeating something I said earlier, that pessimism in this moment of history is a luxury we simply cannot afford. And the pessimism of our analysis can best be overcome by the creativity of our thoughts, our creativity, our action, and so on. And that is what this moment calls for. And we have to recognize that so long as there are people who are not prepared to say that the status quo we have is the best that humanity can create for itself, so long as there are artivists, cultural creatives, and so on who are pushing the envelope and saying we can we can make a difference, there is hope, there is always hope, and let's have fun at the same time as we take on the biggest challenge that humanity faces, which is reversing the suicidal trajectory that we are on with regard to climate change. Thank you very much for inviting me, and good luck with the NGO International Film Festival.
Thank you, Kumi. And just to get back on what you the dedicated driver movement utilized soap operas and TV shows to gain traction here in the U.S. It was an idea that came out of the street, and it was mocked when it first was approached. And through utilization those and things of that nature, and really gain traction to become us today. Thank you, Kumi, for the insightful discussion and all the wisdom that you shared with us today. We ahead, but I hope you've given us really inspired. We can't good. That concludes our program today. If you watch this webinar, go to the NGOIFF International Film Festival website and to learn more about the work we're doing on the Story Lab. Follow us on social media or sign up for our monthly newsletter, Brooklyn Story Lab. To learn more about the work. Look up films in the in October. Thank you, and that concludes the program.